Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for coming, or if you've been here already, for staying. I'm Boyd Tonkin, literary editor of The Independent, and we're here to talk about the wonderful shortlist for this year's Independent Foreign Fiction Prize. And I'm absolutely delighted to welcome two of our judges, Charles Guo on my left, who has actually been shortlisted for this prize for her novel Village of Stone in, I think, 2005. And obviously since then has not only written 3 or 4 further novels, but has also continued with her incredible parallel career as a prize-winning film director as well. So I don't know how she does it. But on my right is Nick Barley, the director of the Edinburgh International Book Festival, by a long way, I think, the most international, the most cosmopolitan, and the most wide-ranging of all our big annual literary jamborees, and just about to announce a fantastic program for this summer as well. So I'm very glad to say, joined me on the judging panel. Our other judges were Hepzibah Anderson and John Cook, and it was the usual round of blood on the floor and torrential arguments, but somehow we got through it. We had an amazing long list of 15 titles. It is now 6, and those 6 titles are Blooms of Darkness by Aaron Appelfeld, translated from the Hebrew by Jeffrey M. Green. Alice by Judith Herrmann, translated from the German by Margot Betauer-Dembo. From the Mouth of the Whale by Shun, translated from the Icelandic by Victoria Cribb. The Prague Cemetery by Umberto Eco, translated from the Italian by Richard Dixon. New Finnish Grammar by Diego Morani, translated from the Italian again by Judith Landry. And Dream of Ding Village by Yan Lianke, translated from the Chinese by Cindy Carter. So an incredible range of fiction, an extraordinary variety as well of styles and fictional forms. And maybe I could start with Nick and ask him about some of the titles that most caught his fancy this year.
Okay, yeah. I suppose the first thing to say is that we started off with 98 books, and it's a pretty daunting prospect trying to whittle down from 98 to this shortlist of 6. But the overall and overwhelming impression was of a very, very healthy sector for literature and translation. And as far as I know, that's the highest number of entries that there's ever been for the Independent Foreign Fiction Prize. And so the starting point was a very strong one. And with a number of strong-minded judges, it was always going to be pretty tough. Very difficult sometimes to let go some of the books which we absolutely loved, but which didn't make it onto this shortlist. I think what was exceptional about this is that we ended up with 6 titles on this shortlist, which we're all quite proud of and we can vouch for. I mean, obviously there are some which I prefer. I won't say which. But I will talk about a few that I like very much. Perhaps I'll start with Aharon Appelfeld's Blooms of Darkness. I need to hold it. I don't know whether you know this author, but if you don't, you really, really must read his book, read his memoir and read this. Aharon Appelfeld fled from Nazi Germany as a child, and much of his writing has been touched by that experience in Nazi Germany. And this extraordinary novel, incredibly moving, is about a young boy called Hugo, whose mother has to flee from the Nazis. And when she realizes that her little boy will be in danger, she deposits him with the only person who will take him, who's a prostitute working in Ukraine in the last days of the war. And this little boy, Hugo, develops a relationship with Mariana, the prostitute, which becomes the most astonishing story of a relationship between a young boy who's just coming into adolescence and a prostitute whose clients are Nazis. And by the end of the story, they've become incredibly close. And there's this, is that me? What's extraordinary about it is the blurring of the boundary between maternal love and sexual love, which it sounds as if it might be very difficult to read, but in fact it's just incredible. Of course, it ends sadly, and I won't tell you exactly how it ends, but truly a powerful, incredibly powerful book. Is that okay? Is that enough?
That's absolutely enough. Yes. Charlie, do you want to talk about anything? Maybe.
Yeah, because for me, I think it's such a different journey. When I lived in China, I used to live all the translation, foreign literature into Chinese. So English literature, as a foreign literature, or Arabic or French. So now there's the other way around. I try to read in English of all the other foreign literature, including Chinese literature. And it's a really great learning process for a writer like me. It's like, once again, went to school, try to understand what's going on in the literature world now, everywhere, in every corner of the world. And it's it's fascinating to discover, how most of stories set in a small little village in a particular land, in the very particular landscape, now how that really echoes strongly, I think within 6 or 7 of us in our perspective, like it talks to us, whether we come from such a different background. And I love some of the books so dearly that it's quite painful we have to make a winner in the future. And I really think that's really cruel. We can only have one winner. But for example, some books I love dearly. For example, the one New Finnish Grammar by this Italian writer. I don't want to pronounce very badly his name, but anyway, the New Finnish Grammar is one of the books I think it's incredible because it's really about. It's a man lost a language, and he lost his memory and life. And through searching back his language, which is supposed to be Finnish in this book, but in the end we didn't discover. We don't discover what's his real language, which means he didn't discover his real life and memory. And for me, that's like the homage of a writer. Try to pay the homage of the language you grew up. Try to write in the language, to remember in the language which you grew up, which for me is a Chinese language, but now I'm writing in English. And of course, the Chinese novel, Yan Lianke's one, Dream of Ding Village, is really, it's extremely beautiful, the painful account of Chinese reality in this disaster village, which everyone dies from AIDS. And I think it's so important to read for everyone, whether whether your taste is, different taste or not. It's just so important to know such a novel exists. And I feel grateful to Boyd and to the whole prize to have humble me to give a humble judgment on those books. And I really feel happy for that. Yeah.
I think I should say a little about a couple of the other titles. The Prague Cemetery and Beto Echo. Now, of course, here you have someone on the shortlist who's already a kind of absolutely enormous giant figure in contemporary world literature, but doing something very, very clever here. It's as if Dan Brown had acquired a brain and a historical conscience as well. It's a novel about not just the roots of anti-Semitism in Europe at the end of the 19th century, but also about conspiracies, paranoia, why we believe ridiculous things, how really toxic myths can spread, and the reasons that people might have for allowing them to spread. It's also a sort of fantastically erudite and cunning and ingenious romp as well. An example of how you can use the forms of popular fiction, which of course Echo is an old hand, a master at doing, in order to tell us something really quite profound about the origins of our modern world. Or, for instance, something completely different. From The Mouth of the Whale by Shun, an Icelandic writer, but also someone else who wears different hats, and one of those hats is writing song lyrics for Björk. And this book is about as far from a song lyric as you could imagine. It's this torrential first-person narrative from a kind of shaman or proto-scientist in Iceland in the early 17th century, someone who's been denounced as a heretic by the religious establishment. We never quite know whether he's a madman or a genius or probably sort of both at once. But it's this enormously voluble, energetic, picaresque account of his adventures and his ideas, which takes us back in I think, a wholly original way to that moment in European culture when you have, as it were, three forces all fighting with each other. You have established religion, you have newly emergent science, and you also have traditional magic. And all of these forces somehow combine in the same voice, and it's an amazing virtuoso achievement. And I realize I haven't said anything about...
Maybe I'll say something.
Yes.
This, do you know this book? This is the first book from Clerkenwell Press, the new imprint. And if Clerkenwell Press manages to sustain its output at this level, then we're in for a really exciting ride with this publisher. You must read this book. Judith Herrmann is one of the most astonishingly accomplished voices in German literature. And if this is the year of the short story, then this is the book which epitomizes that year of the short story. 5 short stories about this woman called Alice. They're linked by the fact that in each of the stories, somebody fairly close to her dies. And whilst we know what's going to happen in each of those stories, the manner in which she tells it and the manner in which she creates the character of Alice is really breathtaking. I mean, it's a wonderful, wonderful novel set of short stories, and I really highly recommend it.
Well, perhaps now we've told you something about why these books are so great, we could talk a little about whether there was anything missing from our reading. Were there any kind of blank areas of the map, any undiscovered territories, any sense of there being important cultures or important ways of writing that are not, in fact, reaching us in English translation to the extent that they should? Chalu, did you have any sense of disappointment at the end of this
I
process?
always play, this bad person in the jury, so I'm going to carry on play this role. I like it. Because I think I remember we were really trying to support, Arabic literature, African literature, and I think that was big battle in the long list. We so much want to support one Arabic book, and then because in the end, the quantity of the Western European language translation was so large. Say, that's 30, and then say, there's a 25 from Western European language, and then there's 5 from Africa plus Arabic country, and it just it was really painful. And in a way, I think the problem lies about the funding and how the funding academic career to support those translators who are willing to translate or learn, Arabic language or African, those local language, and even Chinese, Korean language. There's so little entrance, compare this side of the world, and it is a pity. I think the literature from the south and from the east of the world is very strong and important, and because I think the translation world is not very even. And I think mostly easily, you can do the translation from France, Sweden, Denmark, German, and Italy, And I think the other part of the world is a big task, is easily forgotten in a way. And I hope next year we're going to have much more, submission from those parts, and the boy can fight in the end.
I could do my best. Nick, for you, what was missing?
Well, I suppose the main thing for me is that I'm disappointed that there's only one woman writer on our shortlist of 6. There were other books by women that were submitted, and many of the translators are women, of course. That shouldn't go unnoticed. But many of the books written by women this year at least seem to have been straight crime novels, many of which we felt didn't quite transcend their genre boundaries, and so we couldn't really take them to shortlist stage. I worry that publishers somehow are not being brave enough about what they are willing to translate, and I hope that in future publishers will be willing to look more of women's literary fiction. I'm sure it's out there.
Yes, it's funny because this has been a perennial problem ever since we started the prize up again in 2002. And it certainly hasn't got anything to do with having sort of an overwhelmingly male juries, because that's never been the case either. It does seem to be that there's a big gender imbalance in the literary fiction that reaches us in translation. And I'm not quite sure why this should be and how you start to deal with it. Having said that, of course, it's often the case that the genre writers, including women crime writers, are in fact earning more and selling more than their literary counterparts. So in some ways, it's not a completely negative picture. I would want to say something else about the geographical spread, which is again something that's bugged me for years, which is why there is almost never anything published from the languages of the Indian subcontinent apart from English. Of course, English is an official Indian language. But the whole incredibly rich contemporary literature in Tamil, in Urdu, in Bengali, in Hindi, hardly anything ever reaches us in Britain. A couple of years ago, we had a wonderful shortlisted title, Charangi, by Shankar, the veteran Bengali novelist, which was certainly one of the most enjoyable books we've ever had on the shortlist, I think. And it remains something of a mystery to me why publishers are so unwilling to bring over books from the subcontinent that in many cases have already been translated. If you go into a good bookshop in Mumbai or Kolkata, you'll see that imprints like Penguin India have excellent translations of contemporary classic authors from other Indian languages. Somehow no one even thinks about importing them and selling them here. And for me, that's my perennial regret every year about this prize.
I think there's also a question of, I've asked myself, would Stieg Larsson have made it onto this shortlist? Or any of those very, very successful crime writers? And I think the answer is probably not. Not because it's not good, obviously, or popular, but it's very difficult to judge these books against all the books in other genres. So I think there were a very great number of excellent crime writers who were entered this year, but who just didn't make it through. But which I would have wanted to recommend in another forum.
Yeah. What did you think about the representation of crime fiction?
Yeah. I think because in the first round, selection for the long list, I think we're overwhelmed by the murder story and the thriller story, and I'm so slow reader, who murders who, if it takes me 3 days to find out, I cannot stand anymore, And I think I had this sadness of how, because those writers are really distinguished in their own country, and they are the master of their country, and how little they could explore their literature ambition, through really literature exercise as a writer, but how much occupied by the stress of the market, the commercial valuation of a book. I think as a writer, I felt sad in a way when you see this is the commercialization time, and I felt angry even, when I see the situation. But there's always a hardcore writer really write what he wants to write, and there's always a good translator. For example, I think these 6 books, the translation are amazing. I think we were talking about translator equally a wonderful poet for these 6 books. And some books are very impossible to translate. But for example, I think New Finnish Grammar is beautiful translation in such a nearly Proust way, the translation. You can hardly tell what's original like, You can't even think something could be better in the original language. So this is difficult to say. Because this year is China in focus, so I try to propaganda China in a different way. If you can take a little bit of propaganda from a little voice, there's wonderful Chinese writers, and I think this year we only had 3 or 4 submissions from China.
Yeah.
And in a way, I'm not nationalistic, but I thought, what about those amazing writers like Zhu Wan, like Shu Tong and Han Dong, lots of poets in China writes great novels, and I think Chinese language is just most hardcore thing for you to conquer, and if you can ever conquer, I really hope like there's some money to give into those translator can conquer Chinese literature and equally other Arabic language field. So that's like my crying for some sort of official foundation to support this. Yes. Any foundation can support the translation for this hardcore language. Please to help. And I never do charity, but this is my own charity. Yeah. Okay,
it's very interesting because, of course, in the case of Arabic, we now have the International Prize for Arabic Fiction, the Arabic Booker, which has been going for 5 years, and that is simply an annual judging process for new novels in Arabic. But if you win it, then part of winning it is to be translated into English, so that you have, this year, there are actually 3 separate winners of that prize, which is only just over 4 years old, being published in Britain. It would be interesting to consider whether something similar might be possible for Chinese fiction. On the other hand, I have to say that the Arabic book is also among some Arabic writers quite controversial, because people come along and say, oh, this is cultural imperialism. We don't want to be involved in a contest where, as it were, you're patted on the head and then translated into English. So I think it would take a degree of sort of diplomacy to do this in such a way that the writers involved didn't think that they were being in some way patronized, or that being translated into English was somehow more important than extending their domestic audience. But I'm sure that there are ways of doing it.
Because I think, in a way, if the foreign writer can be translated in English, it's not about English market. It's about, our the commuting language is English, and to be able to read in English, meaning you could communicate with anyone in New Zealand or in Mali, in India, or in any other place, because this is the first language you can conquer. So if a writer crying for communication or publisher try to promote a great writer, we have to come to this stage to be translated into English first. And I think that's a practical process we have to go through. And in a way, I support this prize so much. And I think I want to thank you to those publishers take such a pain to translate those foreign works, for a market which is very much dulled by the commercial work. And thank for that, really.
I wanted to raise another question, which was something that we ended up thinking about a lot. Apart from the balance between books from Europe and books from Asia or Latin America or so forth, there's the very simple, basic question of fat books against thin books. And when you're judging a prize, this actually comes to loom fairly large. How far do you plough through, how closely do you plough through that 1,100-page Hungarian epic? And how can you possibly judge it against that sort of perfectly formed 100-page slim volume of short stories? Now, of course, you could say that this arises with any literary fiction award, but somehow when you're being presented with a cross-section of global work, you realize that these huge disparities of form and approach are also very, very significant factors when it comes to how translations are appreciated. Charlotte, did you feel bashed over the head by
I
epics?
think it was very fun. I was looking the audience
Yes.
gender, difference. I guess women are majority here, because I think during the judge we have two women and 3 men, and we discover all the big fat books written by men, and then the woman is this book, Julia, tiny, something like 80 page until 120 page written by women. And we said we women normally have more patience, but we write very, very small book because we have children, family, and a husband to entertain, to make their life better. So there's always a gender discussion, because I do think there's a way of express, a very different way of express, and also the woman writes very interior, less historical stories. And me myself the same, I barely understand history. I couldn't write a big history book for some reason. But this is something great to explore, it's nearly like a male expression and female expression through literature. How different, the result is. And it's, of course, it's very painful for me to go through 12,000 pages to read.
1,200, not
1,200, okay. I don't want to read 12,000 page books. Yeah.
Nick, what did you think about the question of obesity?
Obesity. Well, one of the things which I loved most about judging this prize is having the opportunity to read books 2 or 3 or 4 times. And when they're thin like this, reading them 3 or 4 times is really easy and really. Every time you read a book like this, obviously it yields something new. Depends on the mood you're in. And there were some books which I loved when I first read them, which I loved much less by the 3rd time. If it's a 1,000-page book, it's very, very hard to bring yourself to read it even twice, let alone 3 times. And so I think it does, in this context, there may be brilliant books, but it really counts against them when they're beyond a certain level. Luckily, all the ones on this shortlist are relatively slim, so they all got a lot of reading each.
I think also there's change, like judging those books. I think the change of, we as writers, we all very foolishly believe, we have to write Proust-style novel, or James Joyce, big, long novel no one can finish apart from you and as publisher. So we have this foolish idea to write big, significant masterpiece. But in a way, I think the world changing, and how we don't lose our quality, but still, integrate our writing into the commercial world without losing your own genuine literature love, and I think that's quite a fundamental question to ask your writer yourself, how to talk to the audience, and this can stop your, in a way, kind of self-indulgence as a writer. You don't care anyone, but in the end you do because you are significant. Your voice has to be read. So that's, it's really personal response, how I see the change of the word in the literature.
Another question I wanted to raise was, I always feel doing this prize, which is a fantastic privilege, that somehow it's almost a bit hard to admit. Somehow I long occasionally for a bit more comedy. That's in that it's in the sense of what is kind of validated and promoted worldwide as important fiction tends to be often, as Charlie was saying, kind of big and male, and also historical, and also sort of clearly addressing huge themes, all of which, it's all good. But you sometimes crave that sort of slightly smaller, quirky, offbeat voice. Now, I don't think we've done too badly. I think the Sean is actually very funny, apart from anything else, because it has such a wonderfully mad narrator. But this may be not just a question about how prizes are operating, but about how translation works. That it could be that those sort of nuances of comedy and wit that make a book in the original are precisely what does fall by the wayside in even a good translation. Nick, do you agree with me?
I absolutely agree, and I was delighted that Sean made it onto the shortlist. There was one Turkish noir thriller which I found very funny, but I can imagine it was a lot funnier in its original Turkish. And I'm sure that there's a huge amount of comedy lost in the translation.
I think there's one French novel written by a very young author, He's not 30 yet. The English translation called Hate a Romance. Reminding me the writer's name.
Tristan Garcia.
So it's a French into English translation about the AIDS community, the gay community in the 80s, and how they died. Everyone in the story dies, and I love a lot. Somehow it's very current, the voice, although it's it's about 70s, 80s AIDS situation in the gay community, but it took to nowadays the anxiety of the society within sexuality and the gender, definition of gender. It took very much nowadays, and I really wanted this can make into Shortlist. Also my admiration for the cliché of French literature, and I really love French literature. So it didn't make it. So, but I still hope if you heard this novel, you still can buy it or read it. It's really an interesting book. Yeah.
There was an opposite tendency as well, which we tended to get rid of, which was what I rather scathingly called torture porn, which were stories written about the horrors of other countries, all sorts of other places. You had to grind through this sort of terrifying, terrible ordeals that people went through, and which I'm sure are very important and which need to be heard, but just I think we couldn't have them on this list.
This is supposed to be a short session that ends at 4:15, so I wonder whether it's time to ask you in the audience whether you have any questions about these books, about the judging process in general, and also kind of what we might have learned about what gets translated into the British market and what doesn't. So if there's anything you would like to ask, I think there's a microphone at the back, so wait until it arrives.
While we're waiting, Boyd, can I ask you a question?
Yes.
What did you think of this year's list in comparison to previous years? I mean, is the quality going up, or is it plateauing? Or?
Well, it's very good. I think you always have to say about this process that every year we say, isn't it terrible, not enough is translated into English. But equally, you have to add a rider to that, which is that we have some absolutely fantastic translators at work. And the quality of what gets published is often on an extremely high level. And so the task for all of us, I suppose, is to try and ensure greater quantity without any diminution of quality, because certainly this year I thought was as good as any that I've judged.
I thought we should write a public letter to Swedish Nobel Academy to say, where is this Nobel Prize for the translation? Because the society changed. Society changed. We in globe, in this planet, we share culture. And who play this role, to be for us to share the culture? But this hasn't changed. The price and stuff hasn't changed. So we really should write different letters, from different corner to Swedish Academy. Please do that. So this is not going to be 10,000. So it will be easily, Boyd, you can have 500,000 to this.
$1 million. Yes,
yeah, that would be so wonderful. Yes. And everybody has to learn translation. And now we understand each other after that.
So, yes.
Hi, my name is Anna Bogdanova. I'm a postgraduate student and a translator freelance. I was just wondering, you were talking about the lack of books translated from Chinese, from Arabic. I was just wondering how the situation with Russian is and whether you encountered some good translations from Russian lately.
From Russian?
Russian, yeah.
Well, Ludmila Ulitskaya's book was entered, and there was a huge amount of discussion about that. And that was a particularly interesting book because it brought all sorts of source material together. It's one of those novels which was a sort of postmodern novel put together by fragments of narrative from all sorts of different places. And I think it came pretty close to getting onto the long list, and possibly the reason it didn't was because we felt that Ludmila didn't quite, at least in the English translation, didn't manage to bring together something which was greater than the sum of its very, very, very many parts.
Can I say something in general, which is that if you look at British literature over the last 100 years, 120 years, no foreign literature has been more influential than Russian. The Russian classics lie behind so many great early 20th century English writers from Virginia Woolf to Forster to D.H. Lawrence. But if you take the perspective of this prize for the years that I've been judging it, in fact, I think Russia has been quite scantily represented continuously, and this certainly didn't change this year. It's interesting to ask why that should be so. It's certainly not for a lack of good translators, because if you look at people like Andrew Bromfield, they're doing fantastically good work. Whether it has to do with the lines of communication that exist and don't exist between publishers here and their Russian counterparts, I don't know. But it's, in fact, in the last year or so, I've read some outstanding contemporary Russian fiction that I don't think was submitted for this prize. There was is his name Solokov, the Ice Trilogy. Yes, which appeared, but I think it appeared in the US. I think it was published by New York Review Editions, and that is the most extraordinary kind of postmodern historical blockbuster. So there are some amazing books out there, but once again, one can only say that I wish we could see more of them in Britain. Is there another question, maybe?
Maybe I just take the opportunity to talk about, because the China in Focus this year, and I did study the program. I think there's 10 or 14 Chinese writers on the photo, and I didn't know me myself on the official program. I thought I'm a naughty one, but anyway, so I was very happy. But anyway, so you don't,
You're still
sometimes you out of prison, you say, oh, I'm still in, but actually, what I want to say is, I think the Chinese writers presented here, every single writer are my mentor, because when I was young, 14, 15, I read these older Chinese writers, and they are here presenting here by the Chinese, we call it Wenlian, Cultural Association, and I think the prejudice about the official writers from China is always, they are, being propagandaed by the government. But we really need to conquer this prejudice, because they are the master of contemporary Chinese literature, and they are the writers inspired me and the young generation. But they cannot be translated because they are in this double suction. Because they're inside of China, you don't have a translator, and they are not like us. The new generation can come out, search for the translation, or learn English by yourself. So those writers cannot be translated, and then they're being prejudiced because they belong to the communist state. I think we have to conquer this, this prejudice. And I just read this program, the Chinese writer program, 10 minutes ago, before I came here. I thought they are really the best writers. And I normally I wouldn't say that, but I think I know there are problems because they can't get translated. And just like, this is a double, it's a double exile. Whether you're in or out, you're exile as a marginal language, yeah?
Could I just, whilst I've got your ear, put in a good word for the translators? Because I think one of the great joys of judging this prize is the realization that the work of the translator is so powerful. And if you challenged any reader to read these books and didn't tell them that these were books in translation, I bet you they wouldn't know. These read as if they were originally written in the English language. And it's an extraordinary skill that the translators have brought to these books. And I think we're just very, very fortunate that we've got those people working on our behalf as readers, making it possible for us to have access to this extraordinary literature. And I just hope that you're earning enough and continuing to have the opportunities to keep translating.
Thanks. Question there?
Go ahead.
Yes.
Just on that point, you say that the books read as though they were written in English. I just wonder whether you worry sometimes that in the translation process, the books are becoming anglicized or Americanized to some extent to make them, and that if they weren't anglicized or Americanized to some extent, they wouldn't actually appear to be as good from our perspective as they do appear to be.
Shall I? That's such a fantastically rich question, because it bears on the entire theory of translation, and we could kind of spend the next 4 hours arguing about it. And obviously there is a danger that publishers might exert pressure to, as it were, smooth out the edges in translation, to make things, to normalize and naturalize them. What I have to say is that for all the excellence and fluency of these translations, they don't sound the same. They all of them sound utterly distinctive, and the voices have an enormously strong color and flavor and cultural specificity of their own. So I think what you point to is something that we always have to be on our guard against, and that clearly publishers shouldn't do, because who wants to read a kind of homogenized global English? So I think the voices have carried into English without any diminution and dilution, which is another reason to celebrate them.
And maybe another thing I want to add is, because normally, say, okay, Chinese haiku, Japanese haiku, Chinese poetry is impossible to translate. And the answer is, so if something impossible to translate, so we give up, or we never have a translation, so that culture can remain completely enclosed, or make a calculating what do you gain, because you gain much by translating even a mediocre translation, because that's nearly an educational process. And when you have basic translation, then you can build on that, towards a better translation. And I see the benefit of how I write in bad English, publish my novel, towards one day I can write better English. This is such a personal experience, and I think still great if you can do it, if you can translate, by some other people, by yourself. And it's such a good way to present your work, and don't scare to be misinterpreted, because if you're strong enough, you can always go there to make a debate and for people to understand you better. So, yeah.
Well, we are supposed to end at 4:15, so maybe I should
Shall we have last one?
Yes, okay. One very quick question. Yes, that's.
Oh, we're not allowed.
No.
So
Okay.
Ask
Okay.
after.
Yes. We'll have to ask it to answer it afterwards. Well, thank you all very much for coming. I would also like to thank my fellow judges, Charlo and Nick, for all their sterling work. And really, I should recommend all of these 6 books to you. They are fantastically different one from the other. Each of them offers a completely unique reading experience, and they are equally a tribute to their author and to their amazingly gifted translators. So please do read them all, and thank you very much for coming along today.